for those of you who weren't here this morning, I already spoke a bit. I'm from a company called Morning Consult. It's a data intelligence company. We essentially do a lot of surveys in a lot of places. So about 30,000 surveys every day in 44 countries around the world, and these are those countries. And my job is to use that data to then look at geopolitical risk. And I'm the managing director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, so I do a lot on the transatlantic relationship. And this afternoon, I'm actually going to look at, as Julia mentioned, digital assets, economic statecraft, and then I'm going to zoom in on energy because it's such a prominent topic right now. It's a bit of a risk going right after the panel on digital assets because now I'm going to talk about where we see retail level adoption worldwide. So these are those 44 countries that you just saw. We run a tracking question asking if you have bought or sold cryptocurrency in the last month. This is a 6-month roll-up to get large sample sizes so that our margin of error gets quite small. Just a few things that I think I should call out. First of all, when I first saw this data, I started saying, okay, well, what's the pattern here? What do these countries have in common? You can see our transatlantic region is actually quite light colored. So we're in the bottom half of retail crypto adoption. A lot of other good data, obviously, on crypto use that's looking at transaction level data, but this is the percentage of people who are actually using it every month. So one thing I'd like to bring to your attention, of the top 10 countries that use cryptocurrency the most, 7 out of 10 of them have some form of capital controls or Forex restrictions. Not saying there's a causal relationship, just something that jumped out at me. What I often hear is, okay, it's inflation, right? Countries with high inflation, they're using crypto as a hedge against inflation. I don't have it here, but I actually looked at that. If you remove countries that have hyperinflation, the relationship is quite weak. If you leave, for example, Argentina, Turkey, some of the other countries with very high inflation in the sample, you do see that relationship. But again, it doesn't seem to be across the board, which in my mind potentially leads us to start thinking about some sort of threshold effects. So CBDCs are obviously one of the big issues of the day. And so I surveyed in these markets, and I always have people, well, why not here or why not somewhere else? These were the markets that I had the opportunity at the time to survey in on CBDC favorability. And what you see is a really mixed picture. And I did the same thing. I sort of said, okay, well, what is the through running thread here? What do these countries have in common? And the most clearly explanatory variable was simply GDP per capita. Emerging markets are much more interested in central bank digital currencies. And emerging markets are much more skeptical. So you can see that reflected in both the countries on the left and then on the right, where I've just plotted them against GDP per capita. These graphs, by the way, are in our recent cryptocurrency report, which I co-drafted with a couple of my colleagues. That's online. You can download it. You can have these figures. And then for this particular conference, and this is where I might give you something additional to think about based on what our speakers talked about, I wanted to look at people who said they were favorable towards a CBDC. What did they think about crypto? So I looked at individual level data. And it's sort of the opposite of this paradigm that a lot of policymakers have, that crypto and CBDCs are diametrically opposed. In fact, consumers are not differentiating between them as far as I can see. And I say that because people who say that private cryptocurrency decreases financial stability are skeptical of CBDCs, and vice versa. And as you can see, the trend is quite strong. And this is across those countries that you just saw on the previous slide. So I think that's really food for thought, not only for policymakers, but for cryptocurrency companies. There's a lack of differentiation of these products in consumers' minds across countries. Okay, I want to move on to economic statecraft, which we're going to hear about later. So I talked this morning a little bit about a potential mismatch in the transatlantic relationship on what priorities are on both sides of the Atlantic when it comes to cooperation. This is a different question. I asked people, what are you very concerned about? And so I think what really jumped out at me is people are across the Atlantic, and I think, frankly, across the world, very concerned about food prices, gas prices. Makes sense. But you start to have a little bit of divergence when you get to international policy. So Europeans, as you can see, are much more concerned about Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think this makes sense to us. As you sit in Europe, it's much closer. It's a very immediate problem. Americans are also concerned about that, but they're more concerned relative to Europeans about China. And there's a 10 percentage point difference, which is quite large when you're looking at public opinion research, in how concerned they are about China's growing influence as a global superpower. So I bring this up because I think as we're looking at the next 6 months, a year of transatlantic cooperation on economic statecraft, I foresee this as a potential source of friction. I showed this slide this morning, so apologies if you already saw it. It sort of drives that same point home. I mentioned that you can see a lot of overlap, but when you start to look at where there's divergence in what you think priorities should be for transatlantic cooperation, Americans are relatively more keen on cooperation on things like export controls and also on coordinating China policy, whereas that does not show up, China policy specifically, in the European Union's top priorities. And I'm reminding you, I'm talking about public opinion, so I'm going to get a European Union official who says that is a top priority. Completely understand, but when you're asking people what should we be cooperating on, again, there's a bit of this mismatch going forward. So it's tough to ask public opinion questions about things like export controls and investment screening, I do admit. Some of the wording that we use is we define critical technologies and then say, do you think there should be partial bans, total bans, no bans at all on national security restrictions on foreign investments in critical technologies, or national security restrictions on exports of these types of technologies? And what we see is, obviously, these bars look like they're far apart. They're quite close together, actually. This is all over 60% support, and really pretty similar between export controls and investment screening. So those are all within the 3% margin of error in the EU and 2% in the US. So in my mind, this tells you that people are generally in favor of national security restrictions on critical technology, but they're not really differentiating between export controls and investment screening. Now, I have a small caveat. I am running some tests in the US, also looking at outbound investment screening, and there are slightly larger differences if you sort of stack them up and ask people to compare them to one another. But generally, it's maybe a nuance that is getting lost. Okay, so this I thought was very interesting. I'm going to sort of shift more to looking at Europe because I'm looking at solidarity and sanctions. And specifically in this slide, I'm looking at the different types of sanctions that have been enacted or perhaps are still in consideration. So obviously secondary sanctions, not something that have been enacted, but I wanted to get a sense of how people view those in comparison to other sanctions. So first of all, I'd like to note really big differences country to country. Italians generally more skeptical, Spanish also a little bit more skeptical. I would say the Germans have quite a lot of spread in their opinions. And if it's not obvious from this, I took the average and arranged them least popular to most popular. And so banning European companies from exporting oil, Russian oil, is the least popular, and then capping Russian oil prices is the most popular. I think it'll be very interesting with oil price caps that are supposed to be enacted by restrictions on companies that are helping export Russian oil. One is the least popular, one is the most popular, so I leave it to someone else to figure out the devil in those particular details. Okay, and now I want to zoom in quickly on energy. A lot of people have looked at, have done polling on support for sanctions. First of all, my methodologists would like me to tell you that the wording varied slightly between the first and second wave. We're very finicky about these types of things, about data quality. So the prompt varied because of the change in sanctions. So we primed people to think about energy sanctions by saying your country has or has not already imposed sanctions on oil or gas, et cetera. And that changed over this period. And so that wording changed, but the wording of the options did not. Do you think that we should have sanctions even if prices rise, sanctions only if prices do not rise? And then finally, we should simply not impose sanctions on Russia as the sort of yellow option. I would say what jumped out to me here, the Spanish and Italians were initially more skeptical and have sort of not moved as much. whereas some of the other countries where we survey, so France, Germany, the UK, were initially much more favorable towards sanctions and have had quite big moves. And I think especially in the places where you see that teal line and that blue line crossing, you're seeing a change in people who are saying, okay, we should only do energy sanctions if prices aren't going to rise. So this is from a piece where I wanted to get a sense of what would Europeans be in favor of to diversify their own energy sources. And then I asked them, what would you do for a neighbor? A friendly European neighbor was the language that I used. And so I think you won't be surprised to see people are really unwilling to pay more. Those are all, if this is a little bit confusing, to the left you have sort of negative net support, and to the right of that line you have positive net support. And so all of the ones on the bottom are the ones people feel the most negative about. And then you see a lot of spread in the countries as you start looking at some of the ones that are more positive. So extending the life of nuclear plants, the life of coal, building new capacity. I'm sure I'll have some energy experts who tell me you're missing an important option. I welcome those conversations after this. So then I took the top 5 from this slide and I said, okay, what would you be willing to do for a friendly European neighbor? And I took the difference. And so when you look at the differences, first of all, it looks a little bad because they're all negative. I think that shouldn't be a huge surprise. However, many of these are not hugely significant differences if you factor in the margin of error, but the one that really is significant here is rationing energy at home. So I think this is important when you're saying, okay, we're going to ask people for solidarity. People seem to be willing to exhibit solidarity more in some areas than in others. And I think particularly rationing home energy seems to be an area where people are not as willing to do that to benefit a neighboring country's energy security. And then I'm American, so I like to end on a happy, optimistic note. So heading into winter, I surveyed sort of right after the cutoff on Nord Stream 1. And frankly, I was surprised by how drastic these results are. And I said, okay, who should pay for Germany's energy security now that they're having all of these problems? And I gave them 2 options. Well, I always give people the option to say, I don't know or have no response, by the way. So these are not forced choices. I said, Germany or all European countries. And as you can see, people really exhibited a high level of saying, no, all European countries have to come together to pay for this energy diversification, even in the current circumstance. So I find that very encouraging. And then finally, and I apologize that this is only in Germany and the UK, it was sort of a quick turnaround when I had an opportunity to survey, after Putin said, okay, I will resume gas flows in exchange for sanctions relief. I think perhaps this goes to human psychology about bullying. You really see an overwhelming response that says, no, we reject this idea of a quid pro quo to grant sanctions relief in exchange for resuming gas flows through Nord Stream 1. So that was a lot of information. Quick recap, digital assets, emerging markets, much, much higher on the usage, and similarly favorable towards CBDCs, but with the interesting caveat that crypto and CBDCs seem to be conflated. Economic statecraft, Europe says Russia, the US says and China, to be seen how that works out in coming months. And then zooming in on energy, I would say solidarity is not dead, but neither is it unconditional.